Welcome to the Environmental Leadership Chronicles, a podcast brought to you by the California Association of Environmental Professionals. This episode is a feature in our CEQA Series. Our host, Konnie Dobreva, speaks with guest Tim Haile, the Executive Director at Contra Costa Transportation Authority, and Meghan Macias, who is Director of Technical Services at EPD Solutions. Konnie, Meghan, and Tim discuss the impacts of SB 743 on VMT mitigation and TDM programs designed to reduce emissions, urban sprawl, and promote the use of alternative transportation. Join Tim, Meghan, and Konnie as they discuss the challenges and strategies surrounding VMT mitigation and its impact on transportation planning and development in California. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Konnie Dobreva. I'm the Executive Vice President of AEP, and I'm also an environmental planner with EPD Solutions, and my pronouns are she, her. With us today, we have Meghan Macias, who is the Director of Transportation Planning and a traffic engineer at EPD Solutions. And we have Tim Haile, who is an Executive Director at the Contra Costa Transportation Authority. Welcome, Tim and Meghan.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate being part of the podcast today.
It's great to have you. As we jump on, can you tell us a little bit about your career in environmental planning, how you got into it, a little bit about your background, and how you're associated with AEP? Tim, let's start with you.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. My background, I started in 1997. I started working my career at Caltrans in 1997 as a design engineer. I'm a civil engineer background. I graduated from Cal Poly Pomona, and my experience has got a mix of both private sector and public sector. Mm-hmm. I worked for Caltrans for 6 years, and then I went to the private sector, worked for a medium-sized firm called RBF in 2003. And then they were, purchased and transferred to Michael Baker in the 2011, 2012. And I had my career there as basically a, project engineer, project manager. I also was the Inland Empire regional manager, as well as the national managed lanes practice leader. And then in 2017, I had a great opportunity to move my family to Northern California. I grew up and had most of my career in Southern California, and moved to Northern California in 2017 to come work at Contra Costa Transportation Authority. Mm-hmm. And Contra Costa Transportation Authority is one of 24 self-help counties in California. We collect a 0.5% sales tax here in Contra Costa County for about a $2.7 billion suite of projects and programs. And we've delivered about $10 billion in projects over the last, we've delivered $5.6 billion over the last 10 years in capital projects. And I think one of the signature things that I think CCTA is known for is our innovation. We are really known to be forward thinking and really embracing new technologies, in transportation. We actually own and operate one of the largest secured autonomous vehicle testing facilities in the country called Gomentum Station. It's in the city of Concord at the Concord Naval Weapons Station. And we've been doing that since 2014. And we recently have delivered some very cool projects. Just in April this year, we launched our Presto emerging mobility brand, if you will. It's a shared autonomous vehicle that's available to the public. It was the first autonomous shared vehicle, no steering wheel, no brake pedal, available to the public in the Bay Area. And so it operates Monday through Friday. So all of you listening, you can go down to San Ramon, California, and take a joyride on an autonomous vehicle if you want.
Amazing.
And so, and we have other projects that will be other autonomous vehicle projects that we'll be deploying in the next couple months, actually. So we have another project we'll be deploying in Rossmore, which is a senior community center. We have another project in the city of Martinez, and that'll be for our county hospital. And then we just announced yesterday our new partnership with East Contra Costa County Partners, which is a public-private partnership with Plenary, Glideways, and Flatiron on a 28-mile closed autonomous vehicle network connecting 4 cities together in eastern Contra Costa County. And so that, I think we're really known for innovation. And I think the automated driving system projects that I mentioned, Bishop Ranch, Brossmore, Martinez, that is actually all part of our Innovate 680 program, which I think we're going to get way more into today as part of this podcast. It's a long introduction. I apologize.
No, not at all. We look forward to learning about Innovate 680. And Meghan, tell us a little bit about your background and how you're associated with AEP.
Sure. Thanks, Konnie. Well, I actually in school intended to go into environmental policy, and I think I thought I was going to be a CEQA planner. But I started my career as an intern at Orange County Transportation Authority, and then my first job out of school was at Caltrans. And I learned pretty quickly that I really do enjoy development, and so I fairly quickly switched back to being in the private sector and working for environmental consulting firm, but on the transportation side. And I think I discovered a career I didn't know existed when I was in college, and that is being a transportation planner, but really more like a transportation analyst, the traffic engineer position, preparing traffic impact studies. So. Early in my career, I did work on some of the infrastructure projects and those types of projects. But like I said, kind of rediscovered that love of working on development. So that is really my background over the last couple decades. And Konnie, always gives me kudos for being a transportation planner that also knows CEQA. But I have to tell the story that, at a different firm, they put me in charge of preparing a small MND. And I was so frustrated realizing I just don't really care whether it's 0.4 or 0.8 acres of wetlands. And reinforced that I really do like working on the transportation issues. So that's been my career for the last 20 or so years. So I think it'll be fun today to get a kind of a different perspective between Tim and myself on SB 743 and implementation of VMT, because I think we're coming from opposite sides of the legislation. How am I involved in AEP? I actually was when I was at UCI getting my master's degree in planning, I was the chapter student representative at UCI, and then I did serve on the board for a couple of years after I graduated. Took a break for a while until I ran back into Konnie 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little longer than that. And then she wrote me back in, so I've been on the local board for the last, I'm going to guess maybe 7 years, and I'm currently the chapter treasurer for the Orange County chapter. So
yes.
Yeah, I guess I forgot how I was connected to AEP. I didn't answer that part of the question, but I think I've always been aware of AEP. It's a fantastic organization with a lot of great resources. Definitely when you're trying to deliver projects. I think recently got reconnected, I think, with AEP just through this podcast. And I think also as just a fun plug, but I actually have my own podcast. It's called On the Patio Podcast. And you can search for it wherever you're getting your podcast. But, I talk about transportation, and I'm excited that we'll be able to kind of co-share or co-produce this podcast in both AEP as well as On the Patio podcast. So excited to do that. And that's how I've kind of gotten reconnected here to AEP.
That's great. So speaking of SB 743 and innovation in transportation planning, Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about Contra Costa County and some of the VMT processes, mitigation measures, guidelines that we talked about a little bit earlier? Yeah,
so Innovate 680 and SB 743, right? So SB 743 was actually passed in legislation back in 2013, and Meghan, you can help me fill in the gaps here if you like. But it was basically kind of relooking at a whole nother approach in terms of really measuring impacts, of projects, both development, transportation, any project that would be considered, actionable under CEQA. And so it was really up to that point, transportation and impacts were measured by level of service, which was primarily delay, right? In terms of, travel time as well as density, those types of things. And it didn't necessarily kind of capture, I'll say, the multimodal impacts, of the transportation system and development. And so I think that's why in like I said, in 2013, Senate Bill 743 was passed in legislation, which required or introduced vehicle miles traveled as a way to measure projects. And what's interesting about the legislation is that it's still up to the project lead to define or how you're going to measure transportation impact. So you can still use level of service if you would like. But I think given the direction of this new way of measuring, I believe, and I know at least most of the project sponsors in Contra Costa County, if not the state, have been kind of shifting gears and measuring both level of service as well as vehicle miles traveled. And I guess now coming at it through a transportation lens, Caltrans, they developed their own implementation guidelines. So they have their transportation analysis framework, as well as the transportation analysis for CEQA, I believe. And so there's two different guidelines in terms of how you're measuring in your traffic analyses, and then how you're addressing it, through CEQA. And that implementation, I believe, was then put into place, I believe, July 1st of 2020, I believe. I might be off by 1 or 2 years there. And that required, and from that standpoint, that vantage point, Caltrans basically said, we're measuring all our traffic impacts by VMT, right? So they made that decision for any project that would be done on the state highway system. And then they basically said that if you do induce VMT as part of your project, you actually have to mitigate it down to zero, right? And that's really the big change in a Caltrans state highway improvement project. When the project is not on the Caltrans state highway system, then the sponsoring lead agency can determine, what those thresholds are. So for example, CCTA, if we're doing a project off the state highway system, we essentially require our partners through our growth management program that we have with all of our local agency partners to at least aim to reduce VMT by 15% in their projects. And so if we're doing like a local improvement project or something like that, or a development project, we do require a reduction in VMT by 15%, not all the way down to zero, and so like Caltrans does. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the approach. I don't know, Meghan, did I leave anything out? But I think that's generally kind of what SB 743 is and kind of the purpose of 743.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I would say more on a development side, when we're looking at individual projects, it's slightly different, only in that we're looking at more of an efficiency metric. So it's usually per person or per employee that we're looking at, instead of looking at total VMT. And sometimes that makes it challenging, because we get comments like, well, what about truck traffic VMT, which is technically not required to be analyzed if we have, for example, like an industrial project. But I do think one other thing to note just about the legislation was that they did name 3 goals of the new metric. So the legislation said, the CEQA should have a new metric, and those goals should promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. They should promote the development of multimodal transportation networks and promote the diversity of land uses. So in terms of creating thresholds and metrics, there has been, I've seen some agencies which have gone with like a greenhouse gas threshold, because they're saying, well, if the purpose of this is to promote the reduction of greenhouse gases, then maybe we should also tie this to our greenhouse gas thresholds. And I've seen other agencies that have said, yes, but then that really doesn't address the other 2 uses, which is multimodal transportation networks and diversity of land uses. So there's been kind of just depending upon which local agency you're in, how it is how it's implemented. I know I've had this discussion with other consultants where they've said, oh yeah, we're using, electric vehicle charging as a VMT reduction. And I'm saying, well, but you're not technically reducing VMT when you are promoting electric vehicles, like you're still driving a car. And I say, oh yeah, but the agencies are letting us do it because we're promoting greenhouse gas reductions. So I think it's still a little bit of a Wild West in terms of how particular local agencies are implementing it in terms of development projects. But it's very interesting to watch, and it's still in flux, at least from that perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. And I think I forgot to mention that, but yeah, I think the 3 goals I think were really important in terms of, really doing a better job of kind of connecting transportation with land use and diversifying land use. Because there's obviously that nexus there. And then, focusing on making the transportation more multimodal and making it, focusing on mode shift, right? And I think that's the big thing that VMT I think helps promote is, this whole concept of, we're never going to build ourselves out of congestion, right? And so I think we have to think about, other strategies, other ways to really improve and ease congestion on our highways, and so as we look towards the future, there's obviously very important, very critical highway widening and roadway improvement types of projects that I think should be done. But I think on the flip side, there's definitely certain corridors, corridors like in LA and certainly corridors here in San Francisco Bay Area, and also right here in Contra Costa County. For example, our 680 corridor is a corridor where we will not widen that roadway. It's at its maximum kind of capacity. It's basically 8 lanes. It's got an express lane in the median, which is a way to manage and provide reliability in the corridor, which is one of an older but newer strategy to the transportation network. But we don't have good, reliable transit in that corridor, and so our goal is to really promote mode shift in that corridor. And with hopefully by achieving a goal of 10% mode shift, that would help ease congestion, in that corridor during peak periods. And, I think we all saw the effects of the pandemic in terms of traffic and congestion. And that's the goal, right? The goal is to have mode shift, whether that have people working from home or have people, use mass transit or transit in buses. That's the real goal here. And I think a big part of implementation of SB 743 is going to be, coming up with those strategies, to promote those different, that multimodal transportation system. And we're doing that through Innovate 680, and so and happy to talk more about that, Yeah,
that was actually my next question. What are some of those ways, right, in those with having congested highways? And my next question was, what are some of those ways in which you're promoting that with Innovate 680, and how successful has CCTA been, right? What's the biggest success that you've seen so far in terms of reducing vehicle miles traveled?
Yeah, so I think, reducing VMT is, I would say it's an old concept, but kind of a new concept because it's being implemented and somewhat being, measured at this point. But Innovate 680, we were developing this strategy even before the implementation of SB 743. Back in 2017, we came up with 7 strategies for this corridor. We knew we had to close the gap in our express lane network. We had to really address kind of last important critical operational improvements in the corridor. So those would be like the 2 last infrastructure projects in the corridor. The third strategy was to focus on improving transit in the corridor. And then the fourth strategy was really looking at how we can use more innovative operational, kind of more advanced technology, type of approaches. How do we leverage technology to improve the efficiency in the corridor? And then the fifth strategy is to how to prepare the corridor for the future. With the coming of autonomous and connected vehicles, right? Like, how do we prepare the corridor for those new technologies? And then the sixth strategy in there was really share mobility hubs, right? So like how to really help better provide that first and last mile connectivity to the corridor. And then the last strategy, which is really the linchpin in my mind, is really the transportation demand management part of the corridor. I think TDM is always going to be important. And in my mind, with VMT reduction, TDM is going to be more important in the future, in terms of really incentivizing people to get out of their cars into transit, right? Like, I'm under the opinion, and I mean, there's 90% of the people in Contra Costa County drive cars. And it's going to be very hard to get those people out of their cars, right? Very hard. And we're not trying to get everyone out of their car. We're just trying to get 10% of those people out of their car, right? And so, which is very difficult. So in my mind, I truly believe you're going to have to pay people to get out of their car, and so I in terms of incentivizing people. And so we've, developed essentially a project for each of those strategies in the corridor. And we're implementing all those projects. And I would say that some of the biggest successes that we've had to date in the corridor in terms of VMT reduction has been our TDM strategies. That's really been, providing better ways to carpool and do ride matching, providing incentives for taking transit and promoting transit in the corridor. And so I think we have kind of looking towards the future. I mentioned that the corridor, doesn't have good transit. So, one of the strategies was to add an express bus service in the corridor, and so when you look at the six, all the projects, right? And maybe just kind of going back to SB 743 and kind of the implementation of this. Our northbound express lanes project is a 7-mile gap closure, right? And that gap closure induces, depending on which alternative you pick, induces about 80 to 100,000 VMT per day in the corridor. And so, using Caltrans's approach, we have to mitigate that all the way down to zero, right? And so when you look at the rest of the strategies in the corridor, CCTA was the first agency in the state to get an approved VMT mitigation program under SB 743 by Caltrans. And so the three strategies that we were able to do that with to reduce, 100,000 VMT to zero was to implement this 680 express bus in the corridor. And then the second one was the share mobility hubs and that first and last mile approach, so that way, most people, I think, know this, but a lot of your trips are under 2 miles in most corridors, right? And so by having share mobility hubs, and rather than kind of having people go and find these alternative modes, our goal is to bring those alternative modes to your doorstep, right? Through share mobility hubs, to make it easier for you to find those alternative modes, right? And whether that be, bike share, car share, whether that be carpooling, ride sharing, but also shared autonomous vehicles, shuttles, transit, all of those things, and making them connected better through a network of share mobility hubs, right? And so those share mobility hubs are a big strategy in our VMT mitigation program. And then the third strategy, we were not able to reduce it to zero just with those two strategies alone. And so just to get the last, I think it was like the last 3,000 or 4,000 VMT per day, we had to triple our investment into our TDM program. And so when you start looking at this, is probably when you start looking at the financial impacts to projects, right? So the northbound express lanes project is a $350 million capital project. And so the capital to implement those three strategies was $150 million. And then because this is an environmental mitigation, right? We had to fund operations out to 20 years because that was the life cycle of the project. Caltrans actually wanted us to mitigate through in perpetuity, but CCTA, we did not want to agree to that because we have no idea what the corridor and what transportation is going to look like 20 years from now. So because we did not want to agree funding the mitigation through in perpetuity, Caltrans is requiring us to do a statement of overriding considerations because of that, because we were not willing to commit to into in perpetuity on the operations piece. So we are funding 20 years of operations, $10 million a year for operations. That's $200 million. So when you look at our funding plan, you've got $350 million in capital, but in the environmental mitigation line item, it's $350 million, right? For environmental mitigation, 150 for capital, 200 for environmental. And so that's a huge lift. I mean, there's very limited funding. There's very limited operational funding. And I think some of the biggest challenges to implementing SB 743 is funding.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point because, as Meghan and I work on the development side, we're working for agencies and these smaller development projects, whether it's, it might be a very large warehouse, it might be a 35-unit infill project that now triggers VMT, and we have to figure out a way to mitigate it. Just listening to you talk about CCTAs, right? The difference in a transportation authority that can actually implement multimodal and implement things that actually make a difference. Agencies, small cities don't have that ability, and it's been so important to have those robust TDM programs that then the agencies can rely on and use, because otherwise it is a completely worthless piece of legislation without funding.
Yeah.
And Meghan, I don't know if you want to speak to some of the challenges or maybe the importance of having transportation authorities that are implementing these area-wide, because VMT doesn't just occur while it does occur within that 2 miles. There is no way that the city of Santa Ana or the city of even a sprawling city like LA cannot necessarily make a huge difference on its own.
Yeah,
I think that's true. And the other challenging thing has been, like you say, Tim, quantifying that mitigation. Like you're not willing to mitigate something in perpetuity, and so therefore your impact remains significant and unavoidable. And we had a very similar situation in the city of San Diego, where we had a small development project with actually a very small impact to VMT. We really didn't have to mitigate very much. And so the city had adopted their Mobility Choices program, which was sort of intended to be a mitigation program that developers could pay a fee into this program in order to offset some of their VMT. But the issue there was that their own EIR had stated that VMT was still a significant and unavoidable impact because they couldn't actually prove the reductions in VMT due to these measures that they were hoping to achieve. It's like, okay, the EIR said they're going to focus funding in areas that, where there's a lot of transit, there's a lot of different choices. They're going to expand those choices as much as possible. We still can't actually prove that they work. So we have this, this thing we're trying to implement to reduce VMT, either, on a region-wide basis or just from an individual project. And yet it's just, how do you quantify it really? And I think it comes down to, the importance of measuring VMT it is important in understanding how much greenhouse gas is transportation contributing, to the state's emissions. But on the other hand, when we start to get down into how the regulatory environment has been set up in order to mitigate it, it's very challenging. And I think that a lot of the programs are disconnected and not necessarily being used to the full potential that they could be. I think that there's a lot of, maybe some of the mitigation that you're having to do could, if it was set up, in a program that was complying with the Mitigation Fee Act, you could be getting developer money to be paying into some of that, but it's a lot of time and effort and money, to be frank, that it takes to set those programs up and make them legally defensible. So it's a lot of bureaucracy to try to achieve a laudable goal.
Yeah, I think Meghan, you bring up 2 really good points. One is when it comes down to a lot of these VMT mitigation strategies, it's very hard to quantify, for example, VMT reduction for shared mobility hubs, because from a traffic modeling perspective, it's hard, you can't measure walking. It's hard to measure biking. It's hard to measure, shared autonomous vehicles and shuttles and all these different things. And so we had to develop an approach, and working with Caltrans on the methodology to get buy-in on how to quantify VMT, right? And so, and then on the other side of this, I know we talked about Innovate 680, but because of SB 743, we're actually developing a county-wide VMT mitigation program. And so, and similar to what you just said, Megan, about development, right? And so, and we're been assessing, how we're going to implement, this VMT mitigation program, again, to make it defensible, like you're saying, and make it to where it's in accordance with the Mitigation Fee Act. And the biggest issue around that is quantifying the VMT mitigation strategies, because what we found is we went through basically a cost benefit or cost versus VMT reduction kind of process, where, because immediately our initial thought was, because we've analyzed a lot of things, like we've analyzed housing, we've analyzed bike and ped projects. And what we found was that, especially in the Bay Area, housing was very expensive. So from a cost to VMT reduction, it was very expensive. It didn't pencil out. Also, bike and ped projects, we actually thought about just taking our entire, bike and ped plan and making that essentially like a VMT exchange program where, developers would pay into VMT fees, and then we would fund these bicycle projects. The issue is the bicycle projects, because they're infrastructure based, they're expensive to build, and because bicyclists is a low percentage of travelers, we weren't getting the VMT reduction needed to. So again, cost of VMT reduction, it was just from a cost benefit standpoint, it didn't rise to the top. What rose to the top was TDM. Mm-hmm. TDM was the most cost effective way to reduce VMT, and also obviously transit was obviously a very cost-effective way, and so again in Contra Costa County, getting people into transit is very difficult. We're primarily a suburban county, and so it really, when you start thinking about it, it really relies on TDM. And so our TDM strategy in the future is to rely on a mobility as a service platform. So as part of Innovate 680, we are building a mobility as a service platform, which is like a Google app on steroids, but it integrates and connects you with all of those mobility services. So all the services that I mentioned in Innovate 680, it's connecting you to all of that in one place. So we have Uber, we have Lyft, we have bike share, car share, carpooling, parking, electric vehicle charging. All those things are literally embedded into one mobile application. It's literally your one-stop shop of transportation in Contra Costa County. And so we're finalizing the deployment of that. We're getting ready to deploy the project in spring of next year. It was funded by FHWA, Federal Highways Administration, through an ATC MTD grant. And I think that's Advanced Transportation Advanced Transportation Congestion Management Technology Deployment.
Proving we have too many acronyms in our
too many acronyms. But and I want to give Federal Highways credit, because I think they're sponsoring and funding some really cool programs. And so that platform is in essence going to be our TDM program, where we're going to be able to hopefully, use our 511 program today, our Contra Costa 511 program, in our TDM program, it's primarily paper-based at this point. You go on the website, you fill out the form. So what we want to do is make the TDM programs more accessible, make them more robust, and come up with more strategies. The other thing that in our TDM program that I see is making it more data-driven because of the quantification issues. So like, for example, in our current Contra Costa 501 program, we hand out 2,500 transit passes. Oh, that's fantastic. But what actually happens with those 2,500 transit? Are people using them? Are they actually reducing VMT. And the reason why that's important is because if you're going to do a VMT mitigation program, you have to be able to quantify the VMT reduction that those 2,500 transit passes actually produced. If you're going to be able to qualify under this Mitigation Fee Act and all this other stuff. And so, anyways, it's this concept of mitigating for development and cost, and tying this all together. It's extremely complicated what we're finding, through the development of our feasibility study. And we hired, in my mind, we hired a lot of great consultants, Fair and Peers, Best and Krieger. They were part of this development of this VMT mitigation program. And we're in the middle of actually looking to implement and build the actual legal framework and build the program in Contra Costa County.
Yeah,
go ahead, Meghan. Yeah,
I was just going to say it'll be really interesting to see the quantification studies. I know other agencies are in the middle of doing that as well, and it's a little frustrating because right now what we have is the CAPCOA report, which kind of here's how you can quantify the greenhouse gas reduction of various things, and under TDM, the big source of data is still the Genentech TDM program from South San Francisco, which is. It's very specific, and it's one employer's TDM program in an area that has a lot of transit. And here we are trying to apply the calculation in somewhere like Hesperia. It just does not. It's not anywhere near the same thing. And we go through all these calculations to try to prove up that it can work and what the reduction and effectiveness is and things like that. But it will be great to have a lot more data on that as time moves on.
Yeah, my last question for you both is, as we've been talking about SB 743 and its implementation, and if you could look ahead in 10 or 20 years, I'll let you finish this sentence for me, and Tim, maybe I'll start with you, is like, wouldn't it be cool if?
Well, I think it'd be really cool if we can figure out a way for people to work from home, because I think incentivizing that to the extent possible is a huge VMT mitigation strategy. I mean, if there was some way that we could incentivize businesses to, it really allow people to work from home and really understand that balance and that schedule. I know that here in the Bay Area, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, our MPO, early on during the pandemic, they were looking at potential types of strategies to require businesses to have people work from home 2 days a week or something like that, and so I think that would be great. And I think the other thing that would be really, really cool in my mind is to really see how technology will help embrace and help with this mode shift. I mentioned a lot of things about, first and last mile and shared autonomous vehicles and those types of things. Those types of strategies, I think, are going to be a huge game changer in transit. I think this could be a whole nother podcast episode about the transit fiscal cliff that is in California right now. But I think by leveraging, first and last mile and TDM approaches, I think could really help incentivize and boost transit ridership to be able to achieve mode shift and our greenhouse gas, goals.
That's awesome. Thank you, Tim. So Meghan, what about you? Wouldn't it be cool if...
I think I have a less visionary answer. I think, wouldn't it be cool if we can make the metric that we're using for impact something that has more buy-in from the general public? Because I think that was the good thing about level of service, is that people could understand it. That why wait for so long to turn left at that signal, and now you're going to put it into a left turn lane and they're happy. And right now, I think we have a threshold that is, like I say, it contributes to the laudable goal of, reducing greenhouse gases, reducing pollution. But on the other hand, nobody really understands it. And I don't think there's wide buy-in, and people feel like it's just a social engineering tool. So I think, wouldn't it be cool if we could come up with something that the general public buys into, that's implementable, that we can actually put into place in our day-to-day work?
Yeah, I actually, Meghan, I couldn't agree more. It's a whole nother podcast, but I think honestly, if the public generally knew what was going on with some of the state policy that's going on right now, I think they would flip out, quite frankly. I think they would flip out.
That's another podcast.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Well, Tim, you have Meghan's information for your next podcast. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you on our podcast and having you be affiliated with our organization. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to be updated when new episodes are released and leave us a review to let us know what you think. It also really helps us to share the podcast with others who may enjoy learning about the environmental industry. If you want to submit a shout out or any feedback, please send an email or voice memo to podcast@califaep.org. The email again is podcast with an S, podcast@califaep.org.